A raging river stole away the daughter of the wealthiest landowner in the county. But the only man willing to risk his life to save her was a poor blacksmith with nothing to his name. What neither of them knew was that the greatest battle would begin after she was rescued, when her own father swore they would never be together. Stay until the end to discover how courage, sacrifice, and true love changed two lives forever. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, please subscribe and join us for more inspiring journeys. Cold gray clouds still lingered over the Virginia countryside after 3 relentless days of rain as the swollen Greystone River thundered through the valley, carrying broken branches, uprooted reeds, and thick brown water toward the lowlands. 26-year-old Ethan Miller walked slowly along the muddy riverbank, checking the old fish traps his late father had built years before. Tall and broad-shouldered from years of working iron at the village forge, Ethan carried the quiet strength of a man shaped by hardship rather than comfort. Thick chestnut brown hair curled loosely above calm blue eyes, while a neatly trimmed beard framed a weathered face that often appeared more serious than his age deserved. The loss of his father 6 years earlier had forced him to abandon youthful dreams and become both provider and protector for his widowed mother. Since then, he had learned to keep his worries to himself, speaking little but never refusing help to anyone in need. Most people in Greystone considered him dependable. Some pitied his poverty. Ethan cared about neither opinion. As he crouched beside a damaged trap tangled with driftwood, a faint cry carried above the roar of rushing water. He froze. For a heartbeat he wondered whether the river itself had deceived him. Then the cry came again. Without hesitation, Ethan sprinted toward the sharp bend where the current grew wildest. Mud pulled at his boots. Low branches scraped across his shoulders, yet he never slowed. As he rounded the bend, his heart tightened. A young woman was being swept helplessly downstream. Her pale blue riding dress had become heavy with water, dragging her beneath the surface each time she struggled to breathe. Long golden blonde hair floated wildly around her frightened face, while a white mare galloped desperately along the riverbank, unable to reach her rider. Ethan did not waste a second thinking. He tore off his coat and plunged into the freezing river. He knew Greystone better than anyone. Instead of chasing the young woman directly, he swam diagonally across the current, allowing the river itself to carry her toward him. When she drifted within reach, he caught her firmly around the shoulders before the current spun them both toward a violent whirlpool. Every muscle in his body burned as he fought the river inch by inch until his free hand found the thick root of an ancient willow gripping the bank. The rough bark tore open his palm, but he refused to let go. With one final surge of strength, Ethan dragged the unconscious girl onto the wet grass. She was barely breathing. Kneeling beside her, he forced river water from her lungs before wrapping her trembling body inside his worn coat. Then he lifted her into his arms and carried her through the rain-soaked fields toward the small wooden cottage he called home. Sarah Miller opened the door before he could knock. At 52, she was a gentle, slender widow with silver beginning to thread through her chestnut hair, kind hazel eyes, and hands permanently roughened by years of sewing, cooking, and surviving with very little. Grief had softened her voice, but strengthened her heart. She hurried to help Ethan lay the young woman beside the fireplace. As Sarah removed the soaked velvet cloak, her eyes suddenly widened. Embroidered inside the collar was the unmistakable Whitmore family crest. "The Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Ethan, this is Clara Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Ethan in that moment. Whether she belonged to the richest family in Virginia or the poorest cabin beyond the hills changed nothing. He simply sat beside the fire, watching every shallow breath until, at last, Clara's eyelids trembled open. She looked at him through exhausted, unfocused eyes. "Did you save me?" she whispered. Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "You're alive," he said quietly. "That's the only thing that matters." The following morning, the quiet road leading to the Miller cottage echoed beneath the steady rhythm of 4 polished carriage horses. Ethan looked up from splitting firewood as a black carriage stopped outside the weathered fence. The contrast between the gleaming wheels and the worn cabin could not have been sharper. The first man to step down was Charles Whitmore. At 56, Charles was tall and broad through the shoulders, despite the silver beginning to overtake his dark hair. A neatly trimmed gray beard sharpened the strong lines of his jaw, while his steel-blue eyes carried the habit of judging everything they rested upon. Decades of managing thousands of acres and hundreds of workers had taught him discipline, caution, and authority. After losing his wife when Clara was only 12, he had buried his grief beneath responsibility until duty became easier than affection. Those who worked for him respected him. Very few truly knew him. A physician climbed down behind him, followed by 2 servants carrying blankets. Charles entered the cottage without arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His eyes swept across the room. The patched roof, the uneven wooden floor, the forge tools stacked beside the wall, the worn boots beside the fireplace. Then they stopped on Ethan's scarred hands. Clara, still wrapped in one of Sarah's wool blankets, slowly sat upright in the chair. Color had returned to her face, though she remained pale from exhaustion. Her long golden hair had been loosely braided by Sarah, making her appear younger and far less like the elegant daughter of the Whitmore estate. The moment Charles saw her awake, something inside him softened. "Clara," she smiled faintly. "I'm all right, Father." He crossed the room in 2 quick steps, placing both hands gently upon her shoulders before examining her as though searching for injuries the doctor might have missed. Only after satisfying himself that she truly lived did he turn toward Ethan. "You have my gratitude, Mr. Miller." His voice remained calm, almost formal. No father can repay the life of his child. One servant stepped forward carrying a polished leather case. Charles opened it himself. Inside rested bundles of banknotes and several gold sovereigns. "It is yours." The room became silent. Sarah lowered her eyes. She knew how many winters that money could feed them. Ethan looked at the open case only briefly before closing the lid with one hand. "I can't accept it." Charles frowned. "You misunderstand me. I don't think I do. You saved my daughter." "I did." "Then allow me to thank you properly." Ethan shook his head. "If I had seen anyone drowning yesterday, I would have done exactly the same thing." Charles studied him carefully. "You refuse because of pride?" "No." Ethan glanced toward the window, where the swollen river could still be seen beyond the trees. "I refuse because Clara's life isn't something that should have a price." For the first time, Charles found himself without an immediate reply. Ethan continued quietly. "If you truly wish to thank me, build a strong fence beside the western bend of Greystone River. Put warning signs there. Every spring that current becomes deadly. Maybe the next child who wanders too close won't need someone to jump into the water." The words hung in the room. Clara looked at Ethan differently than she had before. She had grown up surrounded by people eager to impress wealthy families, hoping for employment, favors, or influence. Yet the man standing before her wanted none of those things. He wanted strangers to remain alive. Charles slowly closed the leather case. "I will see that it is done." There was no argument in his voice, only respect. As the servants prepared the carriage, Clara paused beside the doorway. She hesitated long enough that even her father noticed. She turned back toward Ethan. "I never asked your name." "Ethan Miller." She repeated it softly, almost as though committing it to memory. "Thank you, Ethan." Then she left. The cottage seemed strangely quiet after the carriage disappeared beyond the hill. Days passed. Ethan repaired horseshoes, mended wagon wheels, and tried to forget the young woman with thoughtful blue-green eyes. He told himself she belonged to another world. Then a letter arrived. The envelope carried no family crest, only careful handwriting. Inside, Clara thanked him again, not for saving her life, but for treating her as though she were simply another frightened person rather than the daughter of the wealthiest man in the county. She wrote about recovering slowly, about the white mare named Lily that had stumbled near the flooded bank, about the books stacked beside her bed, and about how lonely a great house could feel when every decision had already been made by someone else. Ethan folded the letter without answering. 3 days later another arrived, then another. Finally, one quiet evening beside the forge, he unfolded fresh paper. He wrote about his father's old anvil that still stood exactly where it always had. He wrote about Sarah humming while baking bread. He wrote about the abandoned shepherd dog that had recently begun sleeping beside the workshop every night refusing to leave despite belonging to no one. The letters continued. Once each week became twice. Without noticing when it happened, Ethan found himself watching the road every Thursday afternoon. Weeks later, Clara asked permission to visit Sarah and personally thank the woman who had cared for her. She expected to meet an uneducated blacksmith. Instead, she found a man who discussed history, poetry, and scripture with quiet confidence, never trying to impress her, never speaking differently because of her surname. For the first time in her life, Clara felt that someone was listening to her instead of her family name. Feelings neither of them intended quietly took root, but inside Whitmore Manor, observant eyes missed very little one evening. Charles placed several unopened letters upon his study desk. "They end today," he said firmly. Clara looked at the familiar handwriting. "A poor blacksmith may have saved your life," Charles continued, "but that does not make him suitable for your future." She met her father's unwavering gaze without lowering her own. "No, Father." His brow tightened. "I think you've mistaken wealth for worth." The silence that followed felt heavier than any storm the Greystone River could ever bring. Spring arrived quietly in Greystone, but warmth never reached Whitmore Manor. Behind its pale stone walls, silence had become heavier than anger. Charles Whitmore spent more evenings inside his study than with his daughter, studying land contracts instead of family, convinced that firm decisions protected those he loved better than gentle words ever could. One evening he summoned Clara without explanation. She entered to find another gentleman already waiting. William Harrington rose politely as she approached. 29 years old, William was tall and impeccably dressed, with carefully parted dark blonde hair, smooth fair skin, and sharp brown eyes that rarely revealed genuine emotion. The son of Richmond's most influential banker, he had been educated in Boston and had learned from childhood that every conversation was a negotiation and every relationship carried value. He was courteous to everyone, generous in public, admired by society, yet people closest to him often noticed that kindness came naturally only when it served a purpose. Charles stood beside the fireplace. "William has agreed to our proposal." Clara looked from one man to the other. "Our proposal?" Charles answered without hesitation. "Your engagement." The room became unbearably quiet. "No," the single word surprised both men. William remained composed, offering a practiced smile. "Miss Whitmore, perhaps we've simply had too little opportunity to know one another. I don't wish to marry you." Charles folded his hands behind his back. "This has nothing to do with affection. It concerns your future and this family's security. My future belongs to me." His expression hardened. "No, Clara, your feelings are clouded by gratitude toward the blacksmith who rescued you." She met his eyes steadily. "You've mistaken gratitude for respect." Charles ended the discussion immediately. "The engagement will be announced within the month." Far beyond the estate, Ethan Miller had already made a decision of his own. The letters stopped, not because he no longer waited for them, because he feared answering them. Each morning he found himself looking toward the road before forcing his attention back to the forge. Every unfinished letter remained locked inside the small wooden drawer beneath his father's workbench. He told himself that silence would hurt less than allowing Clara to become the subject of endless gossip. Love, if it truly cared for someone else, sometimes demanded walking away before causing greater harm. But each quiet evening felt heavier than the last. Clara noticed the silence immediately. 1 week, then 2. She reread every letter Ethan had written until the paper softened along its folds. For the first time since nearly drowning, she felt genuinely helpless. Then another invitation arrived, not from her father, not from Ethan, from Margaret Whitmore. Margaret, 48, was Charles's second wife. Tall and graceful with dark auburn hair, always arranged perfectly beneath elegant hats, she possessed striking green eyes that remained calm even while delivering painful truths. Widowed young before marrying Charles, she had spent years learning that reputation could be destroyed far faster than it could be rebuilt. Unlike Charles, who ruled with certainty, Margaret preferred quiet persuasion. People often mistook her gentle voice for kindness, until they realized every word had been carefully chosen long before it was spoken. Her invitation, however, was not intended for Clara. It was addressed to Ethan, curious but respectful. Ethan accepted. The butler escorted him into the grand blue drawing room where Margaret waited alone. She thanked him politely for coming. Tea was served. Neither touched it. "I know you've stopped writing," Margaret began. Ethan remained silent. "That was wise. I didn't stop because I wanted to. I know." She studied him for several moments. "You seem like an honorable man. I try to be. Then allow me to speak honestly." She explained what village gossip had already begun whispering. Some believed Ethan hoped to marry above his station. Others believed Clara had become infatuated with the excitement of being rescued. "If this continues," Margaret said quietly, "people won't blame my stepdaughter. They'll blame me. They'll call you ambitious. They'll call her foolish." She paused. "And eventually they'll destroy both of you." Ethan lowered his eyes. Every fear she described had already lived inside his own mind. Margaret placed a folded document on the table. It contained ownership papers for a comfortable farm nearly 50 miles away. "Take it." "No." "You haven't even looked. I don't need to. It would give you a fresh beginning. It would look like payment. It would be protection." Ethan slowly pushed the papers back. "I've never asked Miss Whitmore for money." "I know. I never asked for land." "I know. I answered her letters because she wrote first." Margaret believed him. She truly did, yet belief alone could not silence society. "If you care for her, I do. Then leave Greystone." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he finally spoke, his voice had become almost painfully calm. "I won't sell my life." Margaret nodded. "I expected that answer, but—" He looked toward the rain-speckled window. "I won't seek her again." The words felt heavier than iron. "If my absence protects her name, then that's what I'll do." Margaret quietly stood. For the first time that afternoon, genuine sadness crossed her face. "I hope," she whispered, "that one day neither of you regrets this." By evening, the truth reached Clara. She marched directly into her father's study without knocking. "I won't marry William." Charles looked up slowly. "You will." "No. You leave me no choice. You never asked whether I had one." His patience disappeared. Within the hour, Clara was confined to the east wing of Whitmore Manor, forbidden from leaving the estate. Charles informed her that she would soon travel to relatives in Boston until the engagement could proceed without further distraction. 2 nights before her departure, Clara climbed through her bedroom window before dawn. She crossed the dew-covered fields and followed the familiar path toward Greystone River. Ethan was standing beneath the old willow where their lives had first crossed. He looked thinner than she remembered, more tired. "You stopped writing," she said softly. "I had to." "No. I love you." The words escaped before he could stop them. "I love you enough to let you hate me if it keeps your future safe." Clara stepped closer. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice never trembled. "A safe life chosen by someone else isn't a life at all." Neither of them noticed the first rays of sunrise breaking across the river as silence answered the words they neither could take back. Thunder rolled across Greystone before dawn, and by sunrise the sky had disappeared beneath black clouds. Rain fell harder than anyone remembered, turning fields into lakes and dirt roads into rivers of mud. By mid-morning, frightened riders arrived at Whitmore Manor with the same terrible warning. The western dam was failing. Built decades earlier to protect the Whitmore farmlands, the aging stone barrier had survived countless storms, but years of hidden cracks and neglected repairs had finally surrendered beneath the swollen water. If it collapsed completely, every tenant cottage in the valley below would be swept away. Charles Whitmore immediately ordered every stable hand to secure the breeding horses. Wagons were sent to move grain from the storage barns before the flood reached them. William Harrington agreed without question, insisting the estate's wealth had to be protected first if anyone hoped to rebuild afterward. Clara stared at both men in disbelief. "What about the families in the valley?" Charles answered without looking at her. "We'll reach them once the estate is secure." She understood then that precious time was already being lost. Ignoring every order given to her, Clara mounted Lily and rode through the rain toward the village. Across town, Ethan had already heard the church bell ringing in frantic succession. No one needed to explain what that meant. Grabbing a coil of rope, an axe, and several heavy blankets, he ran from house to house, pounding on doors before the rising water reached them. "Leave everything. Take only your children. Get to the northern hill." His voice carried through the storm while frightened families stumbled into the rain. Among them lived Benjamin Carter, a 73-year-old widower whose bent back and white beard reflected a lifetime spent farming Whitmore land. Years earlier, a falling oak had crushed his left leg, leaving him dependent upon a carved walnut cane. Proud and stubborn, Benjamin refused to abandon his tiny cottage because every memory of his late wife remained inside its walls. "I'm not leaving," he shouted. Ethan placed both hands firmly upon the old man's shoulders. "Your wife would rather lose a house than lose you." Benjamin looked into the young blacksmith's eyes. Then, without another word, he nodded. Together, they struggled toward higher ground. By afternoon, the dam finally gave way. A deafening roar shook the valley. Water exploded through the broken stone wall, carrying fence posts, barrels, trees, and shattered timbers into the floodplain below. Clara found Ethan beside the flooded crossroads. Without exchanging a single word, they immediately divided responsibilities. She led frightened children and elderly neighbors toward the church hill, while Ethan searched every remaining cottage one last time. As the current deepened around his knees, a desperate cry echoed across the water. A little girl clung to the roof of a collapsing shed. Her grandfather stood trapped below, pinned beneath a fallen wagon wheel. Without hesitation, Ethan plunged into the torrent. The current slammed him against a fence post, tearing his shoulder across jagged wood. Warm blood mixed instantly with the muddy water. Pain flashed through his body. He ignored it. He reached the child first, lifting her onto the remains of a floating gate before fighting back toward the trapped old man. Every movement sent burning pain through his injured shoulder, yet he forced the broken wagon aside just enough for Benjamin Carter to crawl free. Together they reached dry ground moments before the shed disappeared beneath the flood. Not far away, William Harrington had stopped his carriage beside another flooded lane. Inside the wagon rested silver, account books, and documents belonging to both the Harrington Bank and Whitmore estate. One frightened tenant begged William to help rescue his wife, trapped inside their cottage. William looked toward the rising water, then toward the wagon. "We cannot risk losing these papers," he ordered the driver forward. Charles witnessed everything. He saw Ethan bleeding while carrying strangers to safety. He saw Clara standing ankle-deep in freezing water, comforting terrified children instead of returning to the manor. He saw William ride away. For the first time, certainty abandoned him. That evening, exhausted survivors gathered inside the village church. Rain still battered the windows. William approached Clara before everyone present. "Our engagement will continue," he declared calmly. "Difficult days require stability." Clara looked directly into his eyes. "There is no engagement." Murmurs spread throughout the room. William's expression hardened. "My father already owns nearly half the debts against Whitmore estate. Break this agreement and your family may lose thousands of acres." Silence followed. Charles slowly stood. The weight of decades rested upon his shoulders. He looked first at William, then at Ethan, finally at Clara. A bitter realization settled inside him. He had accused Ethan of pursuing his daughter for advantage, while he himself had nearly traded Clara's future to protect land and reputation. "No." His voice remained quiet. "The engagement ends tonight." William stared in disbelief. "You would sacrifice your estate? I nearly sacrificed my daughter." William gathered his coat without another word and walked into the storm. Long after the church doors closed, Charles approached Ethan. "I judged you by your poverty." Ethan said nothing. "I was wrong." He paused. "But one act of courage does not build a lifetime." Ethan nodded. "I agree." Charles looked toward Clara. "If you truly love her, prove that what stands between you is more than one heroic day beside a river." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "I don't need you to give Clara to me." His voice was calm, despite the blood soaking through the bandage around his shoulder. "She doesn't belong to anyone." He glanced toward Clara. "I only ask that you stop standing in the way of her own choice." For the first time in many years, Charles Whitmore found no argument strong enough to answer. Summer slowly replaced the scars left by the flood. Fresh grass covered the riverbanks, Once more, broken fences disappeared beneath new timber, and the sound of hammers echoed across Greystone as neighbors rebuilt one another's homes. The storm had taken buildings, fields, and livestock, but it had also stripped away many illusions that people had carried for years. Ethan Miller returned to the old forge without accepting a single acre of Whitmore land or $1 from Charles. Every morning before sunrise, smoke rose once again from the stone chimney his father had built decades earlier. Farmers arrived with broken plows, cracked wagon wheels, bent horseshoes, and rusted tools. Ethan repaired each one with the same patience, whether the owner possessed 20 acres or only a tiny vegetable garden. Word quietly spread beyond Greystone that the young blacksmith cared more about honest work than easy profit. Within months, the workshop became busier than it had ever been during his father's lifetime. Not far away, Clara chose a different path. Using the inheritance left by her late mother, she purchased books, desks, blankets, and supplies instead of new dresses. An abandoned storage house near the tenant cottages became a small school where children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic during the mornings. In the afternoons, Clara visited families still rebuilding after the flood, often arriving with baskets prepared by Sarah. She no longer appeared as the distant daughter of a wealthy landowner. She became someone who listened before speaking. Whenever Ethan and Clara worked together, they occasionally disagreed. He believed every problem should first be solved with practical effort. She believed some problems required patience before action. Neither always proved correct. Instead of arguing to win, they slowly learned how to understand each other's reasoning. Their affection grew not from the memory of a rescue beside the river, but from ordinary days filled with shared labor, quiet conversations, mistakes honestly admitted, and mutual respect freely given. Charles watched everything without announcing that he was watching. He noticed Ethan never mentioned rescuing Clara while speaking with customers. He never hinted that he might someday inherit Whitmore property. When invited to formal dinners at the manor after the flood, Ethan always dressed neatly, but never pretended to belong to high society. He remained exactly the same man, whether standing inside a marble hallway or beside a smoking forge. Nearly a year after the dam collapsed, Charles walked alone to the blacksmith shop. There were no servants, no carriage, only the landowner and the young man shaping hot iron beneath the afternoon sun. Ethan set down his hammer. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Charles broke the silence. I believed poverty was what made a man unworthy. He looked around the workshop where repaired tools waited to be collected. I was mistaken. His voice carried neither pride nor shame. I've learned that greed, cowardice, and arrogance are far greater forms of poverty. Ethan listened quietly. I won't pretend I suddenly understand everything, Charles continued, nor will I claim I deserve your forgiveness. You don't owe me an apology, Ethan replied. Charles gave a faint smile. Perhaps not. He paused before continuing. I also won't stand before you pretending I possess the right to grant permission. The words surprised Ethan. My daughter is not land to be transferred from one owner to another. He extended his weathered hand. The only thing I can honestly do is stop standing in the way. Ethan accepted the handshake. Nothing more needed to be said. Several evenings later, beneath the same ancient willow whose roots had once saved two frightened strangers from the flood, Ethan asked Clara to walk with him beside the quiet Greystone River. The water flowed peacefully now. Birds nested once again among the branches overhead. Ethan stopped where the current had nearly taken her life. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a simple gold ring crafted with his own hands. It contained no precious stones, only a tiny willow leaf engraved along the band. I can't promise you a grand estate, he said softly. I can't promise endless wealth. Clara smiled before he finished. I know, but I can promise something else. She waited. I'll never decide your future for you. He gently took her hand. I'll ask what you want. I'll listen to your answer, and I'll never mistake loving you for owning you. For several quiet seconds, Clara said nothing. Tears shimmered in her blue-green eyes. Then she laughed softly through them. Yes. She looked directly into him. Yes, Ethan. Their wedding took place inside the small white church overlooking Greystone. Nearly the entire village attended. Sarah cried from the moment the music began until long after the ceremony ended. Charles tried to maintain his usual dignity, yet everyone noticed he smiled more often that afternoon than anyone could remember. Months later, Ethan and Clara moved into a modest new home built halfway between Whitmore Manor and the village. Neither entirely belonged to one world nor abandoned the other. Years passed. Whenever Clara walked beside Greystone River, she always paused beneath the old willow. She no longer remembered only the fear of drowning. She remembered the day a poor blacksmith had pulled her from the current, and the years that followed, when they slowly rescued one another from lives neither had freely chosen. Sometimes Ethan joined her there in silence. When they turned toward home, he always reached for her hand first, not because it was expected, but because every single day he still chose her. Every story leaves us with something different. For some, it may be the courage to keep going when life feels unfair. For others, it may simply be the quiet reminder that the people who change our lives are not always the ones the world expects. Kindness cannot measure a person's worth, and neither can wealth, titles, or circumstances. Sometimes the strongest relationships are built one honest choice, one act of compassion, and one day of trust at a time. If Ethan and Clara's journey touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. Asterisk, what do you think is the most important quality in a lifelong partner? Kindness, loyalty, courage, honesty, or something else? Asterisk. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next inspiring story. Until we meet again, may God bless you with peace, good health, hope, and people who truly see your heart. Thank you for watching, and God bless every one of you.